with the Brookfield Library. Tonight, we are going to give a overview and introduction to the work of Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy, and I'll do that part of the presentation, and then I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and he's going to talk a bit more specifically about our conservation programs. As Rachel said, you're more than welcome to write your comments in the chat function as we go along. As much as possible, I think presentations are more exciting if we interact through Zoom and through the chat function as we go along, but we'll also have a question and answer period at the end. So without further ado, Paul and I have now been here at Nclc for a number of years, Paul for just over 6 years, and I'm now here for 10 years. We work with a lot of different organizations in Connecticut and beyond through our conservation programs and because of our love of the work that we do. Here at Nclc, we are Connecticut's largest land trust. We serve all of Litchfield County and northern Fairfield County, Brookfield, Newtown, and Sherman in particular. We protect public recreation areas, so trails and hiking preserves, working farms, natural lands for rare and endangered and threatened species, and water resources. We protect now over 44 miles of rivers, lakes, and streams. We have been in the business of conservation since 1965, and our work, which covers this regional landscape, hopefully benefits you and all of the residents of Northwest Connecticut and beyond. Currently, Nclc protects 12,000 acres of land in 17 different towns. And what is most important, I think, to remember about the work of conservation is that it depends on individuals. We are one of the largest land trusts in the country by the number of properties we protect. But the vast majority of our lands were protected by people like you who loved and cared about a place, and in many cases, and in fact in most cases, donated that land to the land trust to protect it in perpetuity forever. So our estimate is about 95% of our 12,000 acres were donated by individuals. That's a tremendous conservation legacy that we all, as regular people, make possible every day. Here is a slide that just sort of lays out where our protected lands are. We were founded in the town of New Milford. We were always a regional organization, but our original incorporators were from the town of New Milford, and that's where our conservation work began. We protect 5,000 acres there, 2,000 acres in the town of Kent, now over 300 acres in the town of Brookfield. And our conservation lands are split roughly 50-50 between properties we own outright, so like public nature preserves with hiking trails, and the other 50% are properties that we protect through conservation easements, which means somebody else owns the land, but we protect it to make sure that in most cases, for example, there's no development on that property. So it's protected in its natural state, or if it's a farm, it's protected as a working farm forever. In addition to our staff and our board of directors and our partners, we are really dependent on volunteers to make our work possible. In 2020, we had 75 volunteers to the organization. They gave more than 900 hours of time collectively, which is about 6 months. And their work really varies. We have many volunteers who work on trail stewardship, who help us conduct property inspections. We have to inspect every property that we protect at least once a year. So over 12,000 acres and about 400 individual properties, that's quite an undertaking. And they also help us in the office with administration and communications. Now, obviously, because of the pandemic, we're doing less of that, but we look forward to hopefully a better fall coming up, or a better and better year even next year, and to resume those types of volunteer activities. We could not do our work without our volunteers, and we're immensely grateful for their support and involvement. And they really make a difference in the direction of our organization and the amount of good work that we're able to do. So if you are also ever interested in volunteering, I hope you won't hesitate to reach out to either Paul or I, or just the office more generally. Land trusts have a very unique mission. We are vested with a really important duty, which is to protect a community's irreplaceable lands and waters forever. As a result, we have to be planning our business operations with this long lifespan, a lifespan that is intended to last for as long as the land is here. And in the land trust world, we say, in perpetuity. In Connecticut, there are 135 land trusts. It's really extraordinary. There's almost one land trust for every town in the state of Connecticut. Connecticut ranks third in the nation for the number of land trusts. I think, if I remember, I might get it backwards, but California is maybe first, and Massachusetts and Connecticut are tied for sort of second and third. But Nclc is one of only a handful of regional land trusts in the state. As a regional organization, we have to work with others to achieve our conservation goals. And we work with towns, local land trusts, and other conservation partners to achieve the outcomes that will benefit, hopefully, the communities that we're serving, the species that depend on these natural lands, and the environmental health of our region. We also, as part of that, devote a lot of our time to services to other organizations. Nclc spends about 1,500 hours of its staff time each year working with partners and in support of partners. It's about 28 hours a week on the whole. The kinds of work that we do with our partnering organizations includes providing guidance on acquisitions. Paul has spent most of his career working in the land conservation field. He oversees our acquisitions and stewardship program. I'm an attorney, and so together we really try to make sure that we're able to provide the best resources we possibly can to our partnering organizations. We help with funding on acquisitions, grant writing, mapping. We have a terrific young woman in our office who oversees all of our conservation easements, but also specializes in developing maps on our behalf, and you'll see some of her work later. We do collaborative events and trainings, and we also share employees. So we will hire, for example, interns in the summer, and then devote some of their time to assisting other organizations, often doing work like trail monitoring and upkeep. In 2019 and 2020, we also completed 2 mergers, and we changed our names. So some of you may have known us under our prior name, which was Weantenaug Heritage Land Trust. But in 2020, as a result of our second merger, we changed our name to Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy. I'm going to talk about one of those mergers a bit more than the other, because the first merger, which took place in 2019, was with Brookfield Open Space Legacy, Inc. And I hope most of you know that that was the all-volunteer town-based land trust for the town of Brookfield. They were also founded in 1965, and at the time of our merger, they protected 167 acres in town. We partnered and began partnering with Bosley in about 2015 because we owned an abutting preserve to one of theirs. So we have 2 preserves, Pratt and Birch Rocks, and one was owned by Weantenaug at that time, and one was owned by Bosley, and they had a shared trail system. And we first came together to partner on the maintenance of those trails, and then on the development of a new parking lot in on the Bosley piece. They had needed a new parking area, and we were able to bring some funding to help them accomplish the goal of building a really beautiful large parking area on that property, so there would be ample access to the trails. And we benefited from that because we didn't have good parking on our property for trails. So we could use their parking area also to access the trails that were on our property. And it was a real win-win situation for both organizations. And that partnership continued. And then the picture you see up here, you know, I'm sure any of you from Brookfield experienced the macro bursts that that came through town and really devastated the community and devastated our properties. And this is here a picture of the Pratt and Birch Rocks preserves with a group of volunteers out there doing work. And it was a really massive amount of work that, and again, volunteer effort. I cannot thank our tremendous volunteers enough for really stepping up and helping us go, you know, really restore these properties. But we had, you know, very dangerous trees that had to be cleared, trails that had to be rerouted and maintained or reconstructed. And through that, in some ways, through kind of the difficulty of having to go through that process, the partnership we had with Bosley was only strengthened. And so shortly thereafter, we merged in 2019. I know Paul's going to say this again, I think towards the end, but this is one of our public nature preserves, and you can find all of our public nature preserves at ctland.org by selecting our lands. And through that, you'll see a selection for trails, and you can see all of the 21 public hiking trails that Nclc owns. And so you can scroll through that and take a look at what's there if you're not familiar with our public trails. If you ever want a personal recommendation, you can email info@ctland.org if you'd like to know of a good place to hike, or you want more specific information based on, you know, the length of the hike or what you're hoping to see when you go out. We'd be glad to give you some recommendations. And in any case, so after the 2019 merger with Brookfield Open Space Legacy, we went through a very similar process with Naromi Land Trust in 2020, and they were the town-based land trust for the town of Sherman. Through these mergers, you know, we were achieving some shared goals of ensuring the best protection for our collective and extraordinary lands in perpetuity. We're also, I hope, able to bring increased staff support to the communities that we serve, and that includes Brookfield. So again, we're here to serve the community of Brookfield. We would love to hear from you, and we hope you get involved in the work that we do if you're not already. Through these two mergers, you know, our land assets really grew. So now we protect 12,000. Before the mergers, we were a little over 10,000, 10,500. So the total lands that we protect are 12,000 acres. And we had 13 new public hiking preserves as a result. So that aspect of our work really increased. After the mergers, and this may also interest you if you're thinking about ways to become more involved, we established two advisory councils, one in the town of Brookfield and one in the town of Sherman. Conservation is inherently local. It's the relationships between people that leads to lands being protected. It's the community input that guides us when we decide what events or programs to hold. And so we have an advisory council here in the town of Brookfield that's comprised of many of the board members from Bosley and others. And we meet on about a quarterly basis to talk about, you know, our work in town and what more we could be doing. So it's another opportunity to get involved if that's something that would interest you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Paul. And as I said, Paul is Nclc's Director of Land Conservation and just superb at protecting lands. So I'll turn it over to him.
Well, thanks, Catherine. Before I launch into the conservation and stewardship end of things, are there any questions on what Catherine has covered so far, and you could put that in the chat. And again, feel free to excuse me, put any questions you have in the chat box, and we're happy to be interrupted to answer them. So there are there are basically two ways that land gets conserved. The first is through donations. As Catherine said, about 95% of our portfolio were donations of land or conservation easements by individuals or families. A conservation easement is a situation where the private landowner still owns the land, and then we hold restrictions over that land in perpetuity. So frequently, landowners will call us and say, I have a piece of property and I'm interested in conserving it and donating it to you. There are income tax advantages to doing that. But most people are motivated to protect the land because they've grown up on it or they've owned it for a long time and they know every inch of it. And they want to see it conserved in perpetuity so it doesn't turn into a big subdivision, or perhaps they're worried that somebody in the future might cut down all the trees or something like that. So landowners will call us and we'll take a look at the land. Or in some instances, we will contact landowners ourselves and ask them if they're interested in conservation and talk with them about the advantages of doing that. So the basic steps towards conservation are at the bottom of the slide. We take a look at what are called the conservation values, what's on the land, where it is, are there forests, are there wetlands, is it a good piece of property for hiking or other public access, is it next to other conserved land, how big is it, how steep is it, is it nice and pristine, or is there maybe a dump on it that we're not so interested in? Does it look like it's easy to manage in perpetuity since we have to go and we take on this responsibility? Or maybe is it next to a junkyard or overrun by ATVs or things like that? So we assess all of those. And if we feel like it's a good fit and we can take care of it appropriately, and it's got nice conservation values, maybe some threatened and endangered species or things like that, then we will talk to the landowner about it. And in the case of an easement, we have to negotiate the terms. We run title on all these properties because we need to make sure that, first of all, we're dealing with a landowner who has the power to make this gift to us. But we also want to make sure that there are no liens or anything that might cloud the title and give us problems in the future once we own it. We do other due diligence. We make sure that the property's clean, that there's no dumps on it, that there may be, no other issues. We're a nonprofit, so our board has to approve the transaction. And then we will close on it and have press, and then we do stewardship, which stewardship is everything that happens after we record the deed or the easement. And it is a very long time. Forever is a long time, but we have to plan to take care of this property for over 100 years. Next slide. So sometimes we will also purchase a piece of property. And again, sometimes landowners will approach us and say, I have this beautiful piece of property. I can't afford to donate it. Can you purchase it from me? Or we will speak with landowners about conserving their land and speak with them about purchasing. The steps are roughly the same, except for in order for us to purchase a piece of property, we have to know what the fair market value is so that we don't overpay. as a nonprofit, we should not be overpaying for anything, but certainly a piece of property. So we have to get an appraisal, and then, you know, just as you're buying your house, we don't want to pay too much, and the landowner doesn't want us to pay him or her too little. So there's a negotiation to that effect. Again, we do our title, we do our due diligence. We have to seek our board's approval. And then because it's a purchase, there would be a significant fundraising component. We don't have a land acquisition account where we can just write a check. So any property that we want to conserve where we're buying it, we have to apply for grants, either from the state or the federal government or from private individuals. And then we have closing and press and then we have stewardship. Frequently, we protect farms, and we're working with the state of Connecticut Department of Agriculture to enroll farms in the Farmland Protection Program. This is a program where the state and the federal government put up the money to purchase a conservation easement over farmland. And the advantages are that the farmer gets some cash. The farmer can continue farming. They could sell the farm once they're done, not for development, but to another farmer. They can retire farm debt. They can take the money and put it into their retirement accounts. They can buy new equipment, and they can do all of the above. So that's become a big part of our land acquisition over the last 3 or 4 years. Next slide. And so when we look at a piece of property, what is on the land that we care about? So we want to know if it's adjacent or nearby to other protected land. It's always an advantage to create larger contiguous areas of protected land. It makes it easier for animals and plants to move around because then they're safer. It also helps protect species that may not like the edges of forest or the edges of land. They want to be in the interior where it's dark and safe and away from people. So the more and larger areas that are contiguous and protected, better. And we also want to create unbroken corridors or chains of protected land, again, so that species can migrate. We're increasingly looking at lands that we think will be harbor species as the climate changes, as the climate warms. There's a way of looking at the landscape called climate resilience. And the more resilient the landscape is, the sort of more niches there are for plants and animals to either change their range from north to south, or perhaps go up slope where it might be cooler and is a better area for them to live. We look at whether there are any known threatened and endangered species on land. We're particularly interested in large areas of unfragmented forest. These are called core forests. They're unfragmented areas. There are no roads. There's no houses in an area that's at least 250 acres in size. So, and these core forests are very important for rare forest species, but also for water quality. The more forest there is, the cleaner the water is that comes out of them. We're looking at high quality habitat, whether it's wetlands, forest, talus slopes, things like that. The larger the parcel, the better. It's easier to steward. It's easier to create public access on a large parcel. We're looking at streams and wetlands, whether parcels are over known drinking water sources. We're always interested in the farmland soils and if it's active farmland, and whether a particular piece of property that we're looking to conserve will support public recreation. When you have public recreation, you always have to think about where trails would go, where people can park, whether the public recreation is going to impact negatively neighbors. Perhaps the trails might connect to another trail system, things like that. And we are also curious about whether the public supports a particular acquisition, especially if we're going to buy something. So next slide. So just to put our landscape in context, and Catherine might want to move her cursor around. So this is our area. The center of the slide is Northwest Connecticut. As you can see from this area that's outlined, Northwest Connecticut is the best route from the Hudson River and the Hudson Highlands in the southwest to the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts, and then up to the Green Mountains, and then up to Canada. Brookfield is down sort of towards the bottom of the screen, but the principles of expanding on conserved lands, trying to create corridors and chains of protected lands, and looking at the different habitat characteristics all apply in Brookfield, in addition to the areas on this map. The area that's highlighted happens to be areas with large areas of these large unfragmented forests that that we're hoping to conserve and link together, so that if you have a species who's by the Hudson River, perhaps in 10 or 15 years, it will have a completely safe way to travel from the Hudson to Massachusetts. Next slide. So we can't protect everything, nor should we. So we have to look at the landscape and figure out which areas we might want to protect, and which areas may not be, there may not be enough resources to prioritize them. And so we have put together a model using computer mapping software where we can look at every parcel in Litchfield County and rank them according to which conservation attributes they might have in them, and then prioritize them based on whichever conservation attributes are we feel are most important. So just for an example, in this slide, the protected lands are in the green, and then the lands in this particular town that we feel are the most important to protect, that are over 50 acres in size, are purple. And then the second tier properties are in orange. It doesn't mean that that other properties aren't worthy of protection. It's just that these have been ranked the highest. And we can go through every town and run this similar analysis to figure out where are the most important pieces of land to protect. Are landowners interested? Is there money available? Do they want to donate? Things like that, and then we go about the business of conserving them. Or if a landowner says no, then we move on to another piece of property. Next slide. So once we have protected the land, then we have to take care of it. And so this slide includes a whole list of things that we do in order to take care of our property. We have 446 pieces of property, either conservation easements or land that we own. We have to visit every one of them at least once a year, and visit is either on foot or in the air or by digital aerial monitoring using satellite photos like Google Maps and things like that. There's trails to maintain. We have events. If there is a problem on a piece of property, we have to be a little bit of a cop and enforce our property rights. Maybe somebody's cut some trees and we need them to fix it, or somebody, we're actually dealing with an issue where someone has gone in and taken our stone wall, and we know who did it, and we have to go after them and say, listen, please put the stone wall back where it goes, because that's our boundary. And so working with scofflaws like that. we use a lot of science and do a lot of work to make sure that our management is according to the highest standards and the best science around. We work with a lot of other partners. Nclc owns about a dozen farmed properties, so we lease those out and we deal with our farmers. And then we have monitoring and education and events like what we have going on now. Next slide. So this is another picture of our poor Birch Rocks and Pratt Glen property that got hit by the macroburst. As you saw earlier, there were a huge number of trees down, and they came down over and on our trails. Next slide. And so it was a big task to take care of the property and get all the trails cleared so that people could go hiking again. We were very fortunate that people from the town of Brookfield came out in droves to help us out. And one day we had about 19 volunteers come out, and we got a huge amount of work done. One of the very nice things that Catherine pointed out about this picture is nobody's wearing a mask, because this was in 2018 and 2019. So hopefully we will shortly get back to having volunteer events where we can all be outside together and get nice pictures like this. And again, if you're interested in helping us out, we'll send an email to info@ctland.org, and we'll put that email address up again. Next slide. So one of the fun things that we've been doing recently is we've been setting out remote wildlife cameras. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, these are cameras that automatically take pictures whenever there's movement. We have them put in at a couple of preserves. One of our members of our Brookfield Council, Summer Hoganboom, has put some cameras at the Pratt Glen Preserve, so she will be getting us some photos shortly. But on our properties, this is a subset of the animals that we have seen and recorded, and there are lots of other songbirds that are out there. And talking about the science, we've had some accomplished birders visit one of our properties, our Smirsky Farm in New Milford, and they've recorded over 70 species of birds on that one property. So if you go to the next slide. This is a picture of a black bear. Next. And beaver. Both of these are taken at our Cobblebrook Vista Preserve in Kent. Next slide. Here's that picture of this beautiful great blue heron, and then another picture of a heron at night. Next slide. This is a bobcat, again, at our Cobblebrook Vista Preserve in Kent, walking across a beaver dam. Next slide. And this is the bobcat video. You'll see sort of at the bottom right, the bobcat slinking away. And there's another one that's approaching from the background. We have a lot of videos taken from the same spot of quite a large number of animals. So next slide. This is a mink, and both during the day and at night, and what a difference a week makes. The daytime picture was January 15th of this year, and the nighttime picture is the 21st when everything froze up. Next slide. Of course, they're deer. They're deer everywhere, both active both during the day and at night. Next. This was taken from a vernal pool at our Mount Tom Preserve in New Milford. Vernal pools are seasonal small bodies of water that fill up in the spring and then are generally dry by June. And they host a large number of waterfowl. You see these are 2 male wood ducks and a female. And they're also critical for the life cycles of amphibians, and reptiles, frogs, tadpoles, turtles, salamanders, things like that. Next slide. And of course, you can't have wildlife pictures without coyotes. Next slide. So we have 2 short coyote videos here as well. There's another one in the background. You can go to the next slide. And here we have a really nice look at a coyote running away. Next slide. And so, sorry for the pun, but we'll leave the remote camera pictures behind and talk about a couple of the preserves in Brookfield. So we have 2 preserves that are open with public trails. Next slide. The first is the Birch Rocks Pratt Glen Preserve that we've talked about. This is a copy of the trail map. We are happy to email this map to anyone who wants a copy. It's also up on the kiosk. Next slide. This is a picture of the parking area. I would like to give a special shout out to the Brookfield Parks and Rec Department, who has very nicely been plowing this parking lot for us this year. In our first major snowstorm, they plowed the lot, and we had a lot of people in there snowshoeing and cross-country skiing and hiking in the snow. Next slide. The really special part about this preserve is that it gets you right down on the shores of Lake Willamette. Next slide. And there's a nice bench and a picnic area overlooking the lake. Next slide. Our other preserve with public trails is off of Hopbrook Road. And the address is 10 Hopbrook Road. This is our Kalo Preserve. There's a very short but really beautiful out and back trail that crosses a stream and sort of winds its way through a little gorge. It's short but sweet. Next slide. This property was also hit very hard by the macro burst. This is our Director of Development, Matt Soper, repairing the bridge that's there. We had some massive oak trees come down. Some of them were 2 feet in diameter and they just blew over. But this trail is open and ready for visitors. One thing we do need to do there is put up a new kiosk and get the map in the kiosk. Next slide. And so this map is a little hard to read, but and we can send a copy of it to anyone who requests it. This is a map that shows the names and addresses of all of our public preserves. They are concentrated in Sherman, New Milford, and Kent, though we do have a very nice preserve up in Litchfield and a couple in Sharon, and obviously in Brookfield and then down in Newtown. So this map is available. If you go to our website and click on the tab for Our Lands, there are trail maps that are posted online for every one of our preserves. Next. And again, if you are, we would love to have your help either in the office when it's safe or out in the field. And we do have sort of COVID safe protocols for field work. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and you can get us by email as well. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll take them and we will answer whatever questions you have.
Thank you so much. I do have a number of questions if you'd like to get started with that. I'll start reading them out to you.
Okay, great.
Okay,
sure.
The first question is, how does one get involved with the Brookfield Advisory Group?
So the best thing to do would be to send an email to info@ctland.org and just let them know you're interested in learning more about the council, and then someone will follow up and we'll talk to you about what the council does and get you involved.
Okay, easy enough. Is there a minimum parcel size for land contributions in Brookfield?
That's a really good question. Generally, there's no minimum. If we're looking at small parcels, we would certainly want them to be either especially special or adjacent to land that's already protected. When you have more boundaries, you have more opportunities for issues to come up. Frequently smaller properties that are, 1, 2, 3 acres in size have a lot of invasive plants like barberry and things like that. They may not be suitable for public access. So, the challenge with Brookfield is that there's a lot of development and there are a lot of small parcels. And there aren't a lot of large parcels left that are unprotected. But we evaluate every parcel that is offered to us or that that somebody calls about, and sometimes we have to say no.
Okay. Do you have any plans for sort of longer hiking trails, like connecting them like the Norwalk River Trail?
There are a couple of longer trails in our area. There's obviously the Brookfield Rail Trail, which would be wonderful to expand and link at some point to the New Milford River Trails. There's the Housatonic Range Trail, which is about 6 miles long, that goes from Gaylordsville and Church Road in New Milford all the way down to Candlewood Mountain. And then there are some other initiatives to start linking trails to create longer trails. And then obviously there's the Appalachian Trail and protecting land around that. In Litchfield County, there wasn't really a concerted effort to create a long distance trail corridor at the outset. So we're doing a lot of work linking preserves together so that we can create longer trail systems.
Okay. We're getting a lot of questions in now. Hold on. So has and/or would the Conservancy entertain using its property for clean energy generation?
So I was just pausing to think what clean energy generation someone might specifically have in mind, but no, typically, our assets are held for conservation in their natural state. And so that is the value. Those conservation values are what we protect as an organization. There may be circumstances on certain working farms where the language in the easement might allow, for example, some part of that farm to have solar panels on it for use at the farm itself. So I don't know if that was maybe in particular what someone was thinking about, but generally speaking, our duty and obligation is to care for these lands in their natural condition.
Okay.
And I'll just expand on that by saying that a lot of our properties are forested, and it's you always have to be really thoughtful about whether you want to cut down a forest, which is locking up carbon and sequestering carbon, in order to put solar panels or something else on it. And that's a very fraught calculus. Again, for our farm properties, the state farm easements do allow for some impervious surface, and solar panels would count for that. And we're always interested to see some of the research on solar panels that are elevated and farther apart that would be compatible with growing crops in the actual solar field. That pilot project hasn't come to Connecticut, but other places have experimented with that.
Another question we have is, what are some of the volunteers jobs that seniors can do, senior citizens can do on your behalf?
Great. Well, it depends on the person. So, many of our volunteers enjoy being outside, and then there's all sorts of work that happens on those properties, and that can be marking trails, helping us clear trails. We also have quite a bit of work that happens internally in the office. We have volunteers who come in and help us get our mailings out, and better when we weren't pandemic, we would have cookies and lemonade, and we would all sit around and get a mailing out together. And that was always a big help to us, and we'll be looking for that kind of support once the pandemic ends. We have volunteers who help us in the office just organize our records. We have given special projects depending on an individual's interest. If someone has like a real interest in history, we have records that really tell stories, and we appreciate people coming in and helping us organize our records and think about, okay, well, what stories from our history do we want to be highlighting or making sure we're not forgetting? So we have sort of standard volunteer jobs, and then we have jobs that we're happy to try to craft to the right person. And it really depends on the skills and the interests and the background. Everybody has experience and talent, and we would love to try to make use of that.
I actually have two questions that are similar, and I'll just put them sort of together, which basically, do you monitor animal populations on your lands? And then if so, are there any stories of, are any positive stories about populations of animals increasing that were threatened?
So on our Smirsky farm in New Milford, we have had Audubon volunteers come out every year, I think for the last 5 years. And they've been keeping a running tally of not only the species that they have observed, but also the relative numbers. And that one particular farm, 200 acres, has a lot of varied habitat. It's got hay meadow, pasture, wetlands, wet meadows, sort of shrubby areas as well. And we have 70 species of birds out there, and that's been pretty constant. And then we also have a volunteer who erects kestrel boxes on preserves around Litchfield County. It's a guy named Art Gingert, and kestrels are a really small hawk. They're the smallest raptor in Connecticut. They're sort of our signature bird that we use in a lot of photos for Nclc. They're a small falcon. They're closely related to peregrine falcons. We have, I believe, 5 kestrel boxes on our properties, and some properties the kestrels come every year and successfully fledge. And on other properties, they move around. There'll be a box that'll be vacant for 5 years, and then all of a sudden, kestrels will nest in it. So we have been monitoring those populations for several years as well. Also, there are some known locations of threatened and endangered plants on our lands, and we've been monitoring those populations as well.
Okay, thank you. I was actually sort of curious if you did any work with preserving native species of plants and taking out invasive species from your land or anything. Is there any work like that happening?
Yes, we've done that in the Still River. We have some land that borders the Brookfield New Milford line over there off of Super 7, and there's a rare sedge there. A sedge is a kind of grass, and so we have cleared invasive plants around those sedges and to help encourage them to thrive. And in other areas, yes, we have tried to clear out some of the non-native vegetation so that the natives can get better established.
We protect about 3,000 acres of land that are habitat for rare or endangered or threatened species. And when we're looking at invasive species, for rare, threatened, endangered species, and when we're looking at invasive species work over about 12,000 acres, we tend to prioritize both doing invasive species management to protect those rare, endangered, and threatened species, as well as invasive species management to protect human health. So for example, removing barberry around trail corridors. And so that's where we tend to focus that kind of work.
I would imagine it would be a really large task on so much land to.
Yeah, it's like a
Yes,
very big garden that you have to keep tending.
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course. Just with pollinator pathways and other native plant movements, there's so much interest in that right now. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
do you do any work with the American Chestnut Foundation? Is there any chestnut plantings or looking for chestnuts or anything like that on your lands?
We do. So we've partnered with them in two ways, and maybe more. Paul might want to add. We do have one American chestnut part of our property where we've devoted to growing American chestnuts in collaboration with the foundation, and it's partly on our property and partly on a neighboring private landowner's property. And then when we see chestnuts in the field, we document those and we report those to the foundation. And then often they'll come out and, well, I shouldn't say often, but we just did it recently earlier this summer. We went out and took a hike to see a chestnut population we hadn't previously reported, to check on those tree species and share the location with them. So we do that, and we love doing it.
It's interesting when you the chestnuts have very specific habitat requirements. So you can't just sort of clear an area and put in a chestnut orchard. It has to be the right slope and the right soils, and it has to be fenced in completely, and then you have to get the stock from the American Chestnut Foundation, and you have to be committed to it for about 30 years too.
Sure, I know there's an open space in Wilton that's doing it, and so I'm just familiar with that too. Yep. So someone was wondering when you had mentioned the endangered species of plants, someone actually was wondering if you could tell them what some of those are. Or...
Well, they're
boy.
I know it's if not, we can.
Yeah, no. Paul, do you want to share some?
Yeah. So one of them I think is called purple crest, and it's a small wetland plant. I know it's not on the threatened and endangered species list, but but there are lady slipper orchids that we found, including places in Brookfield. There are some rare. Most of these are wetland plants, and there is up in Salisbury on a piece of property we just protected. There is a list of 3 or 4 different plants that I don't remember off the top of my head. And of course, most of them are identified by their Latin names rather than their common names, which makes it even harder for me to remember. But if this person wants to follow up, we can provide a list.
Thank you. And then there was another, a couple more. I mean, I hope do you have a little time for a couple more questions?
No, these are great. These are fantastic questions.
Yep.
Good. Someone asked, is there testing of soil bacteria for scientific comparisons on your land?
Oh my goodness. Fabulous.
So, so our farmers who are leasing our lands will regularly send the soil samples in, mostly to figure out how much lime to apply and other farming related inputs like that. And by inputs, primarily lime and fertilizer, we are really strongly pushing our farmers on our lands to be as organic as possible, and also to the extent that in some of our leases we've written in that if they're going to use a non-natural herbicide or pesticide, they have to tell us about it and give us the labels. So we're also moving to prohibit the growing of corn on our lands, because it's very hard to have a successful corn crop without a lot of inputs. But I don't think we've tested for sort of soil bacteria and looking at it from that microbial community. But I'll let Catherine finish up this response.
I don't think we have either, but whoever asked that question, email us and tell us more about what you're thinking, because we'd be interested to hear about it.
There was another question that's sort of related to this, which was about the farms and what kind of relationship, what kind of responsibilities they have to you if they're part of your conservation efforts, if they're working farms. I think you started to touch on it with the pesticides, but do they need to follow certain rules, or are there certain criteria they have to agree to in order to be a farm in your under your umbrella?
You know, we protect farms in two ways, because on the one hand, there are properties that we own outright, and then we lease those to farmers. And so then the relationship between us and the farmer is in part that of the terms of that lease. So there may be mowing requirements, or for example, we may ask farmers to postpone mowing requirements until after birds have finished nesting, for example. So we'll have that agreement between the two of us that sort of lays out the practices that are expected on that property. The other way that we protect farms are through conservation easements, and that's when the farmer owns the property, and we, through the conservation easement, ensure that, again, certain practices are maintained and followed. So for example, easements will limit the amount of construction that can take place on a property. And for farms, that means primarily that you're trying to protect those really valuable farmland soils from going to any other purpose other than being used for production. So we, as the easement holder, have to come on the property at least once a year to make sure the terms of the easement are being followed and communicate with farmers in that way. In both cases, it's a real partnership, a very supportive partnership between the land trust and our farmers.
Okay. Someone asked, excuse me, someone asked if there were, sorry, I got pushed up, okay. If there are any sort of target invasive species that they should be aware of for pulling out from their land, which is contiguous with existing conservation easements. So are there any sort of things that are specifically on your radar that people should get rid of, or is that more of a question to email you and you'll send them a list? Or
we can certainly send a list, and you know, there are a lot of invasive plants. Most, you know, some of the most common are the Japanese barberry, which has it's a relatively low plant. It grows, most of the time it grows under about 3 or 4 feet high. It's got the prickers. It's got small green leaves, usually grows very dense. Those are the barberry is the one that harbors a lot of the ticks as well. There is garlic mustard, which is an annual plant. It's got little white flowers, comes up in the spring. It smells like garlic. It's very easy to pull. Barberry is much harder to get rid of. But if you cut it back and keep cutting it back so that it doesn't fruit, then it's much harder for it to spread. Also, the bittersweet vine that grows up on trees, if it gets dense enough, it will overwhelm and kill the trees. You can always cut those with a lopper and just cut all around the trees so that every vine is cut, and then the vines will die. And again, trying to prevent the spread of the seed source. But we have lots of information on invasive plants. If anybody wants to email us, and also if you do email us, give us your address so we can figure out where you are in relation to our other protected lands.
Okay. Are you still open for a couple more?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sure.
A lot of people have a lot of questions. There actually was one question from someone specifically about their property. So I told them that I would give you their email address, or I will forward them. I don't want to share so much specific information, but I will pass that on to you. Someone is asking also for the email address for volunteering and asking if I can put it in the chat. So if you want to tell me that, I could, or one of you could broadcast it out to everyone if you prefer, or we can direct them to a website if that's easier.
Yeah, info@ctland.org is the catch-all for everything, and we check it, regularly. And so if you email that, if you send any email there or question, we'll get it. And I'm not pulling up the chat function right now, or I just type it in myself. So
Here, I got it.
You got it. info@ctland.org.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions and they can't find it, they can always email me. You have my email address from registering, so people can do that too. So people are wondering if there are any environmental professionals on your staff or on your board who are guiding sort of, I guess, the decisions that you're making.
So, yeah, but I mean, we try to hire first and foremost really high quality staff. So I have a master's in environmental management. Paul has a master's in science. Many of our staff have master's degrees. We have a full-time staff of 7 plus multiple part-time people during the course of the year. And so we hire really high quality experienced staff. And then our board, who is now about a board of 13, many of them have been serving on our board for a long time. So we have very experienced board members who have been working in conservation consistently for a long time, both with our land trust and with other land trusts. You don't need to have a background in conservation in order to serve on a land trust board, but we do training and education for each one of our board members when they join, and that's something that's also continuing education for board members as they're serving. So
we also, if there's a specific niche that our staff doesn't have, we will certainly hire contract with a professional. So some of the botany work is, I can tell you what most species of trees are and probably about half the wildflowers in the area. But for some very specific things, we will contract with a biologist, we're not adept at building kiosks, so we have to hire contractors for that too.
So are there any areas of land that you are stewards of where people are not allowed to go? Like that are closed to humans for some reason, for wildlife conservation or plant or whatever the reason?
Yes, we have 21 public preserves, and much of our land is not open to the public. It's either not suitable for public access in terms of, there's not a good place to put trails, or there isn't a good place to park too. When you think about public access, especially in the time of COVID, because hiking has gotten a lot more popular, you really have to be mindful of where people can park. And a lot of our land, we've been protecting land since 1965. So many of these parcels were protected without the intention for public access. This particular piece of property that we protected in Salisbury is unique enough with the forest and the other attributes that public access there, it may not be a good idea for specifically to protect the habitat. And there are a couple of other properties that we have, which for one reason or another, the public would not be recommended to go there.
And you sort of touched on the COVID increase in hiking, and that was another question, whether or not you've seen a huge uptick in hiking, and what that's meant for your organization in general. Has it had a positive effect? Have people been, have people been more interested in hiking and more interested in your organization?
Certainly for our land trust, the state-owned public lands and the land trusts, every land trust in Connecticut, I think, has seen a real uptick in hiking as a result of the pandemic. And I, by and large, find that to be really positive. I personally, being someone who likes to try to find the positive, do look back at this period of time and think, what lessons might we come away with that taught us something or were good to take with us? And if one of the lessons of the pandemic is that these natural lands bring value to our lives, if that's one of the lessons we take away from this period in time, I think that would be extremely valuable. And certainly for myself in my own life, being outside during this period of time has been really recharging and important. And so I think we're seeing many people who feel that way, and that's a good thing.
I think it's a good thing too. So I would leave it at that, and I have one more comment that I would like to read, and that is that someone wrote, as a frequent volunteer, I can attest that Paul and Catherine and the entire Nclc team are easy and great to volunteer with. It's very rewarding.
Oh.
I'll give a little
wow, that's great.
for volunteering. So
I'll give that person a gold star.
I will. I'd say their name, but for privacy.
But thank you so much for saying that. And if anyone has interest, we need you, and conservation happens because people care. So let us know, and we'd be glad to work with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I just want to say, I hope that we can have you guys or other representatives of Nclc back to talk about other projects. I think there's a lot of interest, and it's great work that you do. So we'd love to be able to be a venue for you to share what you're doing. So you're welcome back. And I hope that people are listening can watch the calendar at the library to see when there'll be more presentations. So
thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And we did record it, so if anyone wants to refer their friends to it or something, it'll be on the Brookfield Library YouTube page.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.